Hello, hello, you're listening to Andy's Book Club. If you're new here, welcome. This is a show where we go over an exciting book chapter by chapter on a weekly schedule. Every week, I provide a recap of the chapter we're covering, and I add my commentary as we go along. If something requires more explanation, I might reserve some time at the end of the show and discuss it in more detail. So, whether you're studying for a test, writing an essay, or if you're like me, you're just super passionate about reading, this show is perfect for you. As a reminder, this show is available on YouTube, Spotify, and a whole bunch of other platforms. And if you're watching this on YouTube, the links for all those other platforms are down below in the description. Or if you prefer, you can simply just search for Andy's Book Club directly on your favorite platform. But wherever you might be listening from, if you like the show, be sure to follow and subscribe. This show also has a Twitter page, so if I need to post visuals, I will do so on Twitter, so be sure to follow me there. Last week, we discussed how Jaehaerys ascended to the Iron Throne at the young age of 14, and within the first month of his reign as king, he had already managed to win over the trust and respect of many of his subjects and largely reconciled the crown's relationship with the Faith of the Seven. This week, we'll delve deeper into his time as king and check in with him on how things are going. The year is now 49 AC, and the year started off with a bang, with the news arriving by Raven that Rhaena, Jaehaerys' older sister, had married Androw Farman, the second son of the Lord of Fair Isle. Recall that Fair Isle, an island off the west coast of Westeros, was where she had fled to when she was originally trying to escape from Maegor the Cruel. And after the death of Maegor, she had returned to Fair Isle after not wanting anything to do with the King's Court and King's Landing. This news of her marriage, however, was met with some controversy. Rhaena had not invited her mother, Queen Dowager Alyssa, to the wedding, nor did she ask for permission from the crown. You have to understand that in the traditions of Westeros, women were often seen as political tools, especially on matters of marriage. And most marriages among the upper class were not done for love, but for practical reasons. The Hand of the King, Lord Rogar Baratheon, was especially upset. Recall at this point that Jaehaerys was still too young to rule by himself, so Rogar was the de facto ruler until such a time that Jaehaerys is old enough to rule by himself. Rogar was upset that he had a brother and two nephews that were of the right age to marry Rhaena, which of course he wanted one of them to marry Rhaena because it would be especially beneficial, as it would put his house much closer in the line of succession if he managed to make that happen. And now with her marriage, that hope is now gone. Jaehaerys and his younger sister Alysanne reacted in the opposite way. They were really happy that their sister got married and sent her many gifts. Meanwhile, as the news of Rhaena's wedding filtered through, another wedding was announced. A marriage between Lord Rogar Baratheon himself and the Queen Dowager Alyssa. Lord Rogar was the eldest of the 5 grandsons of Orys Baratheon, who's Aegon the Conqueror's half-brother. So yes, Rogar also has Targaryen blood. And Queen Elissa was from House Velaryon. Recall that House Velaryon is descended from Old Valyria. So it was an obvious match. They were currently the 2 most powerful people in Westeros, and both from among the most powerful houses in Westeros. Lord Rogar Baratheon and Queen Elissa were already the Hand of the King and the Queen Regent, respectively, and it made sense for them to officially unite. Jaehaerys took the opportunity of his mother's wedding, where lords from all over the realm had come to attend the wedding, and asked many lords to speak freely and bring their grievances. It was said that Jaehaerys listened a lot, but said very little. Lord Royce from the Runestone in the Vale said of Jaehaerys that he was not his father's son, which is actually a compliment because his father was Aenys, and everyone thought that Aenys was weak. The marriage of Lord Rogar and Queen Dowager Alyssa was called the Golden Wedding, due to its many festivities and just general good times. However, an interesting thing to note was that Rhaena had not attended her mother's wedding. It was clear to all by now that the relationship between Rhaena and her mother was not good. But anyways, after the Golden Wedding, now became time to start thinking about who Jaehaerys and his younger sister Alysanne would marry. Lord Rogar suggested that Jaehaerys marry the daughter of the Archon of Tyrosh. Tyrosh is a free city on the continent of Essos. The Tyroshi are known for their colorful dyes which they apply to both their clothes and their hair, and the daughter of the Archon of Tyrosh was described as witty, charming, and beautiful, with her hair dyed blue-green. A union between the Iron Throne and the royal family of Tyrosh would be extremely beneficial in giving the Targaryens a firm ally on the continent of Essos. This idea, however, was opposed by Queen Elissa. She argued that the people of Westeros would never accept a foreign queen, and also the Tyroshi did not follow the faith of the Seven, but they had their own religions. This would, of course, bring the crown into conflict with the faith again, and after decades of conflict of just having been largely resolved, she wasn't about to open that can of worms again. The Grand Maester, Bennifer, suggested that Jaehaerys should marry the daughter of one of the great houses of Westeros. Honestly, that's not a bad plan, but this opened up the door to everyone shooting their shot at putting their daughter up to be the future queen. This debate went on for about a whole month, with Jaehaerys himself not being part of the debate. Recall the part I mentioned about marriages in Westeros not usually being for love but for political reasons. But the main reason why Queen Dowager Alyssa left Jaehaerys out of the conversations was that she already knew who her son would choose to marry if it was up to him. Jaehaerys would choose to marry his sister Alysanne. It was clear that Jaehaerys intended to keep up the Targaryen tradition of sibling marriages, and Jaehaerys was really close to his sister Alysanne, so it was a genuine, loving, romantic relationship. Yikes, but okay. Queen Elissa did not want her kids to marry each other because she had already been down that road once before. She remembered the pushback that she got from the faith when her kids Rhaena and Aegon the Uncrowned decided to marry each other. So at the very least, Queen Elissa had the goal in mind to keep Jaehaerys and Alysanne apart from each other, and her plan was to marry Alysanne off first to Rogar Baratheon, who's the younger brother of Rogar. Alysanne was of course not informed of this decision, and only found out after the decision had already been made as to whom she was going to marry. This did not go over well with Alysanne. She hardly knew Rogar Baratheon, and it was rumored that based on the very little that she did know about Rogar, she did not like him at all. He was also 10 years older than her. So, upon hearing the news, she ran to Jaehaerys, her one and only true love, and together they fled to Dragonstone. On Dragonstone, Jaehaerys got in touch with Septon Oswyck, who had known Jaehaerys and Alysanne since they were born, and who Jaehaerys knew could be trusted. Septon Oswyck married Jaehaerys and Alysanne with the Kingsguard standing witness. It was only a few days later that Lord Rogar and Queen Regent Elissa arrived on Dragonstone. They were not happy about this arrangement at all. It was said that there were tears in Alyssa's eyes, since she feared the conflict and reprisals that would inevitably come as a result of yet another sibling Targaryen marriage. Lord Rogar was determined to undo what he perceived as absolute madness, and he ordered his men to separate Jaehaerys from Alysanne. But the Kingsguard stood in his way. The Kingsguard was sworn to protect the king, so even though as the hand of the king, he had been the de facto ruler of Westeros this whole time, the Kingsguard only obeyed Jaehaerys. Everybody drew their swords, and a tense standoff ensued. It was moments before disaster that Queen Elissa would speak. In an assertive voice, she forbade any bloodshed, and relented that what is done is done. In the days that followed, while Jaehaerys and Alysanne were happily married and deeply in love, Lord Rogar worked behind the scenes to find a way to undo the marriage. He was upset at what he considered absolute disrespect that Jaehaerys had shown him. For now, he was determined to keep Jaehaerys' wedding a secret. But for now, the year 49 AC would be known as the Year of the Three Brides. At the current moment, there were conflicts all around, And thankfully, by conflicts, what I mean here is interpersonal conflict and not the war kind, but, still. We mentioned earlier that the relationship between Rhaena and her mother, Alyssa, had grown cold. And Rhaena also disliked her mother's new husband, Rogar. Rhaena was upset that Rogar had not stood up to Maegor back when her husband, Aegon the Uncrowned, had launched his campaign to fight Maegor, and Rogar only stood up against Maegor when Jaehaerys was proclaimed king. And also, it seemed like before, when she was younger, she had no interest in being the monarch and was okay with her brother being the king. But she seemed to change her mind somewhat as she got older. And she resented the fact that she, along with her two daughters, had been passed over and not even considered in the line of succession. While on the topic of Rhaena, it is an interesting point to discuss why she married Androw Farman. Androw was the second son of Lord Marq Farman, who is the ruler of Fair Isle. If you ever watched Game of Thrones, the show, you will remember that there's a mercenary company called the Second Sons. The reason why they're called the Second Sons is because Second Sons usually don't inherit anything, since the eldest son inherits from his father. So Second Sons are kind of looked down upon in Westeros, and many of them often go seek glory and status in some other way, like joining a mercenary company, since they cannot inherit anything. So it was a great matter of interest on why Rhaena married the second son of a ruler of a tiny island. It seems like Androw was marrying someone way above his league, or in other words, Rhaena was marrying someone that was way beneath her. Androw was also a very soft-spoken and passive type of guy, so not typically the kind of man that was extremely attractive to women by Westerosi culture and standards. So it was later in history that historians speculated that Rhaena had indeed found her true love on Fair Isle, but not with Androw, but instead with Androw's sister, the lady Elissa Farman. Elissa was the opposite of her brother Androw. People describe Androw as half a girl because of his soft-spokenness. Elissa was more of a tomboy who was skilled at archery and loved action and adventure, and most of all, she loved sailing. It was said that Rhaena and Elissa became inseparable, so conflict was inevitable when Lord Marq Farman died, passing on the lordship to Androw and Elissa's older brother, Franklin Farman. Franklin hated dragons, and he hated Rhaena, and promptly made it known that she was no longer welcome on Fair Isle. Rhaena said plainly that if that was the case, she would not insist on staying somewhere where she was not welcome, and she decided to pack up and go to Casterly Rock, where Lord Lyman Lannister had given her shelter all those years when she was fleeing from Maegor. Meanwhile, Jaehaerys and Alysanne were still spending their honeymoon on Dragonstone. And although later in life their marriage would experience some conflict, for now they were as in love as any couple could be. All the efforts that Lord Rogar and Queen Elissa had made to drive them apart have failed. By now, word had begun to spread of the marriage between Jaehaerys and Alysanne, and it was clear that time was running out to undo the marriage. In King's Landing, the Queen Regent Elissa and the Hand, Lord Rogar, called a meeting. Queen Elissa was ready to give up. Although she still didn't approve of the marriage, what is done, she said again, as she said already once before. But Lord Rogar was not ready to give up. If Jaehaerys would not change his mind, then Lord Rogar was determined to go as far as putting him aside and putting his niece Arya Targaryen on the throne instead. As he said this, a hush fell over the room. What Lord Rogar suggested was in fact treason. Queen Elissa was the first to speak against it. For his insubordination, she dismissed him as Hand of the King. Lord Rogar tried to resist, however, it was clear that the room was against him. Maybe he went a little bit too far this time. Seeing that it was over, he resigned the post of the Hand and stormed out of the room. Lord Rogar returned to Storm's End, and Queen Elissa named her brother, Daemon Velaryon, as the new Hand of the King. At Storm's End, Lord Rogar continued to plot against Jaehaerys by trying to put Princess Arya on the throne. Note that this is not because he loved Princess Arya or anything. It was just because she was young and would serve as a puppet to allow him to continue being the de facto king as Hand of the King, or I guess Hand of the Queen if he had succeeded. But his plot was discovered, and Lord Rogar was now really in trouble for treason. He knew he might be executed any day now, so he wrote his will, so that when the worst happens to him, hopefully his family will be spared. As the year turned into 50 AC, Jaehaerys turned 16, and now he was no longer in the need for a regent. He had become of age and can now take the power into his own hands. And it was under these circumstances that the realm held its breath. Sorry to end this on a cliffhanger, but that's all I have for you guys for this week. Next week, we'll talk about the actual beginning of the reign of Jaehaerys and the resolution to many of the conflict that we just described. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye-bye.